All right, so let's review where we left off last time. We had started working on implementing some server-side services that were able to expose a data model to clients, in particular our client, written in Angular. But these services not only can expose data to us, but anybody who cares to come and fetch it. And if they know the URL, if we advertise our URL to anyone who has that URL will be able to access data just like our Angular application can, right? So for your project, you're supposed to identify a web API and start querying data that you can dynamically then render in your pages in your Angular application. In the same sense, we are also exposing our data. Our data, I don't know that it might be interesting to anyone, but it's some users with some websites, with some applications, with some pages, with some widgets. Okay? But nevertheless, if we had some interesting data to share, we can certainly share it using the server-side programming techniques that we introduced last week. So let's go over those techniques that we introduced last week. So it all starts on the server file here, which is declares a Node.js Express server. Right? It requires this library, it instantiates it, and then it declares that it's listening at port 3100, and it listens at that port for incoming requests. Right? We then pass the instance of the Express library. We pass it to a couple of other files of our own, right, that are implemented under the assignment directory under the app.js file. Okay, if we navigate there, it's located right here. Right? It's your server.js. Dot means start navigating at the current directory and load the file under the app assignment directory and the file called app.js. So it's this one right here. So this is that one. And we're passing it app. So this require loads whatever that it treats this file as a module. The module needs to expose or export either a function or a constant or a variable or some object. And so this entire require evaluates to whatever that module exports. In this particular case, the module exports an entire function. There it is. This is the function. Yes? So this require evaluates to that function, and we are then calling that function, passing it an argument. That argument happens to be the instance of the Express library, which allows us to do all sorts of things, including listening for incoming GET requests, posts, puts, deletes, all sorts of HTTP requests. So last week we implemented a couple of services of our own. We took that app and then we passed it along to another file, right? Of which we implemented under the directory services, under the current directory, under the assignment directory, under the services directory. Right, we implemented a couple of services in there, right? In particular, we implemented one for user, which we're going to use to expose data for the user, and one for widgets services that we're going to use to expose data for widgets. Okay, if this were Yelp, we would expose data for restaurants. If I would be IMDb, I would expose data about movies and whatnot. Yes, I would design my endpoints. And then I would do a lot of advertisement for folks to use my data to look for movies or restaurants or whatnot. Okay? They would use some other stack, or maybe they use this stack. Right? There's many stacks out there that allow you to do similar things. So for the user service, we implemented a couple of endpoints using the app. This is the Express library instance that we're passing along. Right? And we use it to declare 3 endpoints, so that if someone
goes to our domain and uses the URL API user hello, right? Here we used the express library to bind these URL to the following executable, this function down here declared in the same file, and with the request and response that is passed along by the server, right? This function participates in the client-server lifecycle, right? It receives queries from the client, and that request from the client is all encapsulated in this request object, and then it can then send back data back to the client. In this case, it's just responding with a hard-coded hello string, right? Hello from user service. Yes? We implemented a couple more for being able to retrieve all the users, right? Implemented down here that find users, which it ballooned into a more than just returning the list of users, right? It became a little more than that. It checks to see if in the query string we have certain filters, such as username and password. This would be passed along using the question mark, the query string at the end of a URL. Right? So we're passing it along with username and password. More commonly, we would be posting this data as opposed to passing it as a query string. But we'll talk about that a little later. And then we use it to either look up a user from our local hard-coded array of users. Right? We look it up to look for a user that matches with the username and password. If we do find it, we return that user. If we don't find it, now we check to see if the username matches. If it matches, we send back that username. From the client's point of view, we use it to either log in and identify someone, or for registering someone. Right? We look up if that username is already taken. Right? It's the responsibility of the client to use this data appropriately, right? For whatever use case it's implementing on the client. It is not the server's responsibility. Right? The only point of this endpoint is to just exchange data back and forth. Right? If we want to, in addition, actually log in somebody or and implement some kind of business rules here, right? We would need to maintain state, perhaps identify them against some database, against some authentication authority and whatnot. We're not going to do that just yet. We'll talk about security in a couple weeks, right? So down here, the very last thing, the default behavior is that if none of the above matches, we just blindly return the list of all users. Okay, whether this is a realistic use case that somebody can see all the list of all the users, that again, this is up to the client. Whether perhaps we might want to check whether the current role, the current user, is an admin. If so, then it's okay to return the list of all the users. If not, perhaps we don't do this. Right? We come back with sorry, you're not authorized or something. Right? But again, we'll look about security in a couple weeks. And then the last one is we implemented an endpoint for retrieving a unique ID, a unique user by ID, passing the ID as a path parameter, a parameter that is embedded as part of the URL of the HTTP request. We executed here with find user by ID. We retrieve the user ID from the parameters. Right? What happens is that as the HTTP request comes in, the server intercepts it. Express library is listening at the port, and it parses the entire HTTP request, and it creates this nice little object for us, right? With all the cookies parsed, with all the path parameters parsed, any query parameters parsed, any files if they're uploading any files, any JSON parsed into a nice little body object, any headers that come in from the HTTP request, all encapsulated in this one request object. Right? So this request object represents everything that's coming in from the client, and then gives us a chance to respond back. Here in this particular case, we are retrieving the user ID from the path parameters, and we're looking up for that user in the array, the local array of users. When we find it, we then respond back to with that particular user. Make sense? All right, from the client's point of view, we implemented several components that use this API, right, under source, app, views, user. So in the login, right, we're using we're using those HTTP to implement login, to implement profile, register, but all through a service, right? The components themselves don't actually go out and fetch the data. Instead, they delegate it to a middle tier on the client side, which is encapsulated all in user service. Right? So this is the sister, the mirror image, right, of what we just looked at, but from the client's point of view. Right? They work together. This is where the client side goes and tries to fetch a user by username or password. Right, there it is. This is where the URL is actually built, right? Concatenating the username and password in the query string. There it is, the question mark. We are encoding the query as a query string appended to the end of the URL, and then we're sending it off as a GET request, right? Which matches the user service on the server side, right? So this request find user by credentials matches this. It's implemented in the find users, right? In the find users. So this API here, this URL right here, matches this URL right here, right? The query string after the path, after the URL, is ignored by the server. It's not used to do the pattern matching of the URL. Okay. Instead, in the find users, we then parse that query string, extracting the username and password, right, from here, username and password, that is being passed along from the client, right, and then we treat it one way, right, finding the username and password, and then when we find it, we send it back. From the client's point of view, this is an asynchronous call using an underlying API called the Ajax Api, right? API for JavaScript, asynchronous JavaScript XML, that without leaving the page that you're on, right, makes a call, an HTTP call back to the server, waiting. Well, not waiting actually. Here we are registering a callback, saying, hey, whenever that response comes back from the server, invoke this function. This is a new JavaScript version of function syntax, right? With an anonymous function, a function that has no name, right? That only really you want the parameters of the function. This is the new syntax. You don't even use the function keyword, right? Instead, you just use the equal and greater than, the arrow operator. And this is the new syntax for a function, an anonymous function that has no name. And you say, well, this is the parameters, and this is the body of the function. So we are registering here a function to be called at some point in the future when the response comes back from the server. Right? So it's an asynchronous mechanism here. And the reason is that in the browser, we only have a single thread. Okay? And we can't risk that one thread waiting for this HTTP request to come back from the server, right? There might be a time lag, right? There might be latency between the time the client makes the request and the time that the server responds, right? So we don't want our thread to just wait for this response to come back. Instead, here it's registering the callback. And then the single thread on the browser is free to go do something else, right? Do animations, respond to people clicking or dragging or typing, yes? And whenever the server comes back, right, responding here when it sends the response back with the data, and the response actually comes back to the client, then the .http will invoke this function, right? We'll invoke this function that the component has subscribed to, right? It will notify anybody who has subscribed to this event, and that happens in the component side. So let's look at the component side. So I believe that would be in the login component. The login component is using the user service, right? It's using the user service, it's calling the find user by credentials, and then it's subscribing, saying, I'm not going to wait for you. I'm not going to wait for you. When you're done, call this anonymous function. Call this anonymous function when the response comes back from the server. Okay. What do I want to do? Well, here we are checking to see if indeed we get a user object, right? That it's not undefined, right? That it's not null, it's not zero, it's not false, it's truthy, right? It's an object with attributes. If there is a user, I'm going to assume that it has an ID in it, okay? And we programmatically navigate to the user's profile, okay? Then in the user profile, when we navigate to the user profile, the whole thing starts all over. In the user profile, the component parses the user ID from the URL, right? Because notice in the login, we navigate to profile followed by a user ID, which we have configured in the routes. We have configured that a profile followed by something loads the profile component. So the profile component, right, gets loaded, and on init, it parses the ID from the parameter, this user ID right here, user ID right there. It parses it, and it uses it to go back to the user service, find me the user with that particular user ID, and I want to subscribe to when it comes back from the server, right? So from the user service, we generate an HTTP request to the server, again using Ajax, okay? Using /API/user/user ID, which is handled by the server, right? There it is. We're waiting for a GET request with an API user ID, which is going to look up the user from the user ID, right? Iterates over the array, looking for a user with that ID. When it finds it, it returns it back to the client service. The client service receives it here on the response. It parses it as a JSON and returns it to the component, which is patiently waiting for the user, which is then used to render the profile. Make sense? Yes?
So, like, it would still work if you didn't have just the subscribe and you just had those as three separate lines. Like, after find user by ID.
You still need the subscribe. The subscribe is what invokes the whole thing. It starts the whole thing. If nobody's subscribing to it, the event won't occur. It's using a promise, right? And promises can be cached, and every time you run a subscribe, it re-executes the promise, right? So every time you do a dot subscribe, it says, okay, well, I want to re-execute that original call back to the server. In this case, it's a call back to the server, but it could be anything. Okay. So what I wanted to do is re-exercise, do this a couple more times, so that we practice it a little more, right? And what I like to do it is do it like 2 or 3 times together, right? So that you see the pattern. That after a while, they say, oh, it's the same thing, right? It's a client. The user interface, the view generates an event. The component handles the event and it delegates it to the client service. The client service sends an HTTP request to the server. The server looks it up in some data model, right? It responds back to the client on the service. The client service then responds it back to the component, and the component then sends it back to the view, right? So let's do that just a couple of times, right? And we'll see that it's just the same pattern over and over, right? Once you feel comfortable with it,
I hope you'll feel confident to be able to do it on your own. All right? Okay. So let's do a couple of these. So we did so last time we did user. I don't believe we had started yet on websites. Okay, so let's work on websites. All right.